Since the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, the American public lands have been a foundational part of every American's experience. This is 193 million acres of U.S. Forest Service land, 240 million acres of Bureau of Land Management land. It is a bastion of freedom that we have relied on for timber, mountains, prairies, deserts, and for clean water.
Welcome to The Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, International Expedition Guide, Conservationist, and Yogi, Mandela.
Today, The Trail Less Traveled is being recorded in a forest near Missoula, Montana. I'm sitting down with Hal Herring, an award-winning journalist specializing in outdoor and Western topics, with a focus on conservation and investigative reporting. His work has been featured in publications such as The Atlantic Monthly, The Economist, and Orion. Hal serves as a contributing editor at Field & Stream magazine and hosts the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers podcast and Blast. Residing in Augusta, Montana, Hal is a lifelong outdoorsman, hunter, and fisherman. He is also the author of Famous Firearms of the Old West, a book that delves into the history of notable American firearms. First and foremost, thank you so much for your time and energy joining me here on The Trail Less Traveled.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. It's a beautiful place.
Where did you grow up, and how was adventure and conservation a part of your childhood?
I was born in Alabama. I'm in Huntsville, Alabama, actually, and that's North Alabama. My parents, if you were listening to this internationally, this probably wouldn't make any sense, but my parents were from South Alabama. Those are two very different universes. And they came to North Alabama to raise their family, to work and raise their family. And when I was 11, they never really got along in the city of Huntsville. It was kind of a boom there, and we were always kind of nature-oriented people, and so they rebuilt an old log cabin, and we lived out in the country about 20 miles from Huntsville, I guess. And for me, that was the formative element of my life. I had been hunting. I had been learning to hunt as a little kid, and fishing and roaming every square patch of woods in Huntsville. And but when we moved out to this is the Southern Cumberland Mountains, the edge of Jackson County, was northeast corner of Alabama. One of the most biodiverse places in the world, and you can really see it when you're living there, and especially as an 11-year-old boy who loves that kind of thing anyway. So that was really it. I mean, and my parents facilitated my hunting and fishing. My father was very busy. I had 4 sisters, all of them at college at the time, and so I was pretty much on my own, and that actually, I value that. I read the books like James Fenimore Cooper. I read Field & Stream. I read Outdoor Life. I read Last of the Mohicans. I was steeped in the romance of being in the woods, steeped in the romance of fishing and hunting. And so that life led me on, that kind of defined what I've done with the rest of the life. Came west in 1988. I was interested in writing because I love to read. That was really the only thing. I didn't have some extraordinary story I had to tell the world, but I was interested in writing because my primary life outside of the outdoors was reading books. And I came to the all-day writing workshop in 1988. That's up on Flathead Lake. And I met Tom McGuane and Annick Smith, and I think Tobias Wolff was there. It was really great. And it kind of reconfirmed my idea that writing and literature was an incredibly viable way of spending a person's serious life. It's a serious life. And that's how I came to Montana. And I was on the train. I took the train. I got off in Whitefish and hitchhiked to Missoula. And it was the fires of 1988. And I was in the Palace Bar in Whitefish. I think I was 22, 21. And they came in looking for fire crew. And I was like, you know what? I couldn't do it right then because I was going to Yellow Bay, right? But I was like, this is a place I could make it. I had been a tree planter in Alabama with a Hodad planter for the paper company. And I knew and had cut a lot of timber. And so I was like, this is a place where I could actually make it. And that turned out to be true. The woman who's my wife now, and I left Alabama and drove to Montana, and I put my name up at the agricultural co-op in Stevensville, and I was hired onto a hay crew within days. And that job led me to a 2-year stint in the Bitterroot on a little ranch there, kind of managing the hay operation. And relevant to any talk about public lands, I had been in Alabama all my life where we had kind of a mental map of every public land that you could get to, right? And there are some incredible national forests in Alabama, courtesy of the Weeks Act of 1911. But you really are kind of on your own in Alabama. It's hard to get public access to hunting and public access to just, roaming for distance. Well, I found myself running hay crew on the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest, and I started going back there to all the way clear to the Divide and then into Idaho to the Selway. And I never got over that. I mean, the first year I was a resident, I actually got a bull elk up there and a long pack, the whole thing. And very long pack out. Took me days. And I was lost in the romance of the West and huge spaces and mountains and mountaineering. And really the idea that we had these public lands that a person could just get lost for the rest of your life. You'd never see them all. And that led me down to the Pentlers, right? And I started learning how to ski. I've never been a great skier, but I learned how to ski and you'd go. So now all your winter the hardest thing was to make a living, to find time to pay the bills. I mean, it was an all-encompassing thing. And while my parents were still alive, which was many years, and before my children were born, I would go back to Alabama and work a lot in the winters. So I maintained this kind of dual citizenship. And I've always told people, I never left Alabama because I didn't like it. I love it there. I still love it. Love the country there. It's unmatched. I just found what I loved on a scale that I couldn't ignore in the public lands of Montana. And really, that's kind of it's not an origin story. It's like a life story. And I'm still there. I've made a long trip for this project I'm on in the Shoshone National Forest 3 years ago, where we did 41 miles above timberline, and never got off of public ground. You could have done 41 more in the Washakie Wilderness, but I live to the west of the Bob Marshall Wilderness now, and because my children were born when I took up residence there, they were tiny. That I know that landscape less than I know the Bitterroot Selway or the Selway Bitterroot, because in those years of my 20s and stuff, that's really all I did. And then in the years, my son works as a packer and stuff. He's in Nevada now, but he worked as a packer in the Bob. And he knows that country. That he speaks the language of that place in a way that I don't. I speak that language of that Selway Bitterroot and of the Southern Cumberlands in Alabama, the places that I know the best. But yeah, it has been, this place has been so good to our family. That's how I would kind of just, if I had to sum things up, So that's kind of my story up to now. Writing about it came about because of that thing of needing to pay the bills. And I started publishing. I published with Field and Stream, and I got a check for like $1,500. This was in the 90s. And I was like, wow, I was working with thinning crews back then. And it takes me, like 2 or 3 weeks to get $1,500 off a thinning crew, So I thought maybe writing was a viable way to pay some of the bills. I was kind of wrong about that. Right, it's a very precarious way to make a living, but So is thin and timber.
If you've just tuned in, that's the voice of Hal Herring talking about the transition of going back and forth between Alabama and Montana. I liked how you said that dual citizenship. They're two very different ecosystems.
For sure.
You're talking about public lands in Montana and how much it shaped who you are today. For those listening internationally, how would you summarize this landscape and these water systems in Montana?
It's a very arid place that depends almost entirely on the snowpack in the high country to water the low country. And I think one of the great revelations that I might could actually put this into words was when I was coming across country as a very young person, I stopped on the Clark's Fork of the Yellowstone at the northern Wyoming there, and before you get into Montana. And that was all that beautiful Oglala Sioux country. And the river was filled with snowmelt. And where I was walking was all prickly pear, cactus, and it was one of the most arid landscapes. You know, I grew up in Alabama in the 56 inches of rain a year, right? So this is one of the most arid landscapes ever. And in it was this envelope of freezing cold, flooding water. And I looked up, and you look up in the mountains there, that's where it's coming from. If something happens to that watershed, you don't get the bounty down below. And so early on, I was kind of primed to understand the reason for our national forest and the preservation of this high country snowpack and watershed. But that arid place with that freezing cold water, and I remember there were trout rising, even in the flood, even in the high water, there were trout rising in this eddy. And I was like, man, this is just miraculous, unbelievable. I need to see more of this.
Well, that's the voice of Hal Herring. We have been trying for how long?
Almost 2 years, I think.
Well, yeah. Good things take time when we're both very busy. We do the same thing. You're sitting here with, I must say, for those listening, much fancier equipment than I use. Hal's the real deal. He hosts the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers podcast and Blast. I believe he's going to interview me for that after we record this interview. Today we're going to talk about public lands. And maybe we'll start with talking about why they are important.
Just lately, I think, in the current politics and all, people are talking a lot about national forests and the layoffs and Bureau of Land Management lands. And since I've been reporting on this subject, maybe I ought to establish it from the beginning. So in 1999, I was still trying to get really established as a writer. And I discovered a study produced in Bozeman, Montana, called How and Why to Privatize All Federal Lands Now. And I had been in the Bitterroot for many, many years, and I was just a public lands nut. No matter where I went, that's what I was looking for. Like, you know, we were talking about the Pentler Mountains and the Bitterroot, the Selway Bitterroot, it become the home of like everything I was interested in. And so I was flabbergasted that someone had produced a study of how to get rid of this bastion of American freedom, right? Where like anybody, rich or poor, could just go hiking or take your pack horse and go for weeks, you know, all the way from California to Maine to Florida, you know. And I had experience on the Ocala National Forest in Florida and the Apalachicola National Forest in Florida. Just these wondrous landscapes of where you could just go and fish and camp and live. You know, you can't live there, but you can go and just be there. And there's no trespassing signs. And so I was flabbergasted that someone had studied this and concluded that we should now get rid of all of this. And honestly, that set me on this path that 26 years later, I'm working on a book about it. I have covered it for Field and Stream kind of in a way ad nauseum. Mm-hmm. I wrote the first story for Field and Stream in 2000, and it was called No Place Whatsoever. You will have no place whatsoever if this comes to pass. And that's more true now than it's ever been. I covered it through like the Bundy occupation at Malheur, where they objected to the federal presence on their own federal land. And I watched as America seemed to forget about how incredible this whole idea of having public lands actually is and how unique in the world. Australia has the Crown lands. Canada has the Crown lands. But they don't have the ability in either country to affect policy changes on those lands the way we do. The American public lands are, and I'll talk about where they came from, but they are a perfect representative of the people, by the people, for the people government, right? They are absolutely unique in that. And they are a source of endless conflict over management. And that's good because everybody has different ideas, right? You don't want the same idea. You don't want a guy who just runs mining companies to have full sway. You don't want a radical environmentalist to have full sway. This is what we do in the United States, is we argue. And so to go back to the origin story is in 1891, and this sounds like a lecture, right? No, but it's not a lecture. In 1891, President Benjamin Harrison, he signed the Forest Reserve Act of 1891. This act allowed the federal government to set aside some lands that had not been claimed by the homesteaders. To background that, in 1862, we passed the Homestead Act, the first one, giving away millions upon millions of acres to good American folks who wanted a piece of land of their own, right? And none of this is to downplay the fact that those lands were taken through warfare, genocide, a lot of outright treachery, and a lot of purchase. So none of this downplays the ugly history of the conquest, but it does accentuate what has happened since that. And what we decided was in 1891, we had seen the buffalo completely exterminated. I think that was around 1876, 1878, you started finding none. They had seen the destruction of watersheds. This was the crucial thing. So they said that corporate and industrial interests were taking over timberland to such an extent that it would be possible for homesteaders to never even have access to enough poles to build a corral. Wow. This was particularly in Wyoming at the time, which, not coincidentally, is the Shoshone National Forest now, which was the first national forest. And this is one of the things that Gifford Pinchot and all the foresters of the day were saying. They were going, what we have here is a wholesale takeover of a resource by people that we just have no trust that they will do the right thing by the economy, right? And the other thing that was happening was the sheep grazing and other uses in the high country were causing such degradation of the watersheds that they were pouring down and filling up the creeks, shallowing them out, and the creeks were not making it down to where homesteaders were. And so this was highly obvious in dry places like Los Angeles. They really figured it out there first. And in the Wasatch in Utah, where there doesn't rain hardly at all down in the valley, right? Mm-hmm. But you have these huge snowpack that feeds agriculture and all human endeavors. So the Wasatch was one, Los Angeles National Forest was one. And people think of the frontier as moving westward like that. But we were actually just now engaging in the wholesale log off of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And we were just now understanding what that means to sedimentation and erosion. And then there's legacy sediment, it's called, in the Hudson River that they still have to map to navigate. And that comes out of that White Mountain, all of that huge amount of logging in the Northeast, and the sheer amount of dirt that then migrated down when the timber was gone and the rain and snow fell on bare ground. So you go back to George Perkins Marsh and all these people who were writing about this at the time, and this became part of the United States understanding of our own land. And one of the answers to this was the 1891 Timber Reserve Act, signed by President Harrison. And if you look at the history here, there's John Muir and there's Gifford Pinchot, who is a very pragmatic, utilitarian, early forester, right? And you have John Muir, who wants to preserve everything and wants to write sonnets about the beauty of the high country and never come inside, right? And those are juxtaposed with the absolute flattening of all this timber and the absolute overgrazing of so much of our land that we probably did more damage than any human group has to land in all of history. in a shorter amount of time. And to speak well for us, we also came up with ways to address it and fix it. And Teddy Roosevelt said this after the first forest reserves, but he was a huge advocate of the forest reserves. He said, we must solve the essential questions of conservation. If we do not, it will little avail us to solve any of the others. Because what these folks recognized was that without water, you can argue all you want, but you're not going to grow any crops. Without topsoil, you can have every kind of experience you want, but you're not going to have any food. And so the nature bat's last idea, right? We addressed this, and we did it extremely effectively. And in the beginning, it was mostly for pragmatic watershed protection, and so that the regular people would have access to some timber. And it has not really changed that much from that. 62% of all the water available in the arid West originates on federal public land, almost all national forest. And that is not an accident. That was by design. The fact that we can hunt elk or climb snow coulees or ski or take a 6-week pack trip, that is just, it's not just icing on the cake. It's interest on the principle of these lands protected and stewarded and conserved and kept in federal hands, which means it's a commons for all of us. And it also means that the budgets for managing these lands are spread out across the United States and not centralized to, say, the state of Utah, which would have to create an entirely new bureau to manage these lands and tax everybody or sell them off. So the concept of transferring these lands to the states, which is also constitutionally not valid, but it could be done by Congress. If they did that, you would see what we saw in Nevada with their school trust lands and state lands, which they sold off down, I think they have 3,000 acres left. And so we already have the model for what happens when you transfer these lands. And they would be sold off to the last acre. I can't imagine how anybody could afford to keep them if they were owned by the states. That is what I hope to head off, simply by letting people know the origin story of these lands and why they're so valuable. I have to translate that to people who may never experience these lands. And then for some reason, we all have to translate that to the people who love these lands. And yet, when you ask them, they say, well, we hate the federal government. We don't think they should own any land. And you might meet this person in the Bitterroot wilderness and enjoying every benefit of this federal public land ownership and management, keeping the trails clear. I don't understand that, and that one has baffled me, why we don't recognize how wonderful this deal is that we got from 1891, and why we don't value it in the same way we do the Constitution or the other like foundational elements of the United States of America of which we are all beneficiaries, the good stuff, right? This is in the box with the good stuff. And I can't understand how anybody would not be supportive of keeping that.
Hal, let's transition to a vision for the future of our public lands.
I think everybody's aware now that might be listening to this, at least inside the United States, of the layoffs and cuts of staffing of national parks and the national forests, Bureau of Land Management. I'm going to leave off like the raw numbers. I mean, maybe not. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also losing staff. And I wish that people understood more about what these agencies actually do, rather than this blanket placing them in this despised federal government basket. And I'm not sure how we got to despising our own government, but that's a long story that we don't need to talk about today, because what we're going to concentrate on is on the future of federal public lands and the love I've had for them, and the love of everybody who lives in Montana or Idaho, anybody who lives in the United States has benefited from this and experienced these incredible natural spaces in a world growing more crowded and more cacophonous with human endeavor every day. We have these places where we can actually walk away and experience reality on nature's time and other rules than ours. And I think about a friend of mine, Drew Mapp, who's a great outdoor writer. She said in Oakland during the riots that people's anger was reflected off the hard surfaces of the buildings and the asphalt, and it just became more and more built up anger. And so she took a bunch of her friends and they just went out to the redwoods where the anger and sadness was not reflected. It was absorbed by the timber and the world operating on its own, right? Without people's often fickle engagement. So obviously I'm a big fan of keeping these spaces, but we are looking at a time where we are being asked, all Americans, if we want to hold on to the legacy of the federal public lands. And we haven't really been asked that question explicitly ever since Herbert Hoover tried to give them away right before the country descended into depression. Senator McCarran, a great book, Nate Schweber, This America of Ours, details this plan. Senator McCarran of Nevada was going to try to take them all over. There'd been this weird skullduggery right underneath. But for the first time, we're being asked right now is, what do you value? And my answer to that, which I would like Americans to ponder and maybe decide on, is, do you value these national forests, national parks too, and Bureau of Land Management lands? And how much do we value them, and what do we want to see in the future? For most of my adult life, we've kind of held the line. We have great biologists, great timber foresters, great people planning engineering, mining, sales. We have great ecologists working. But they've kind of held the line. There hasn't been this vast upswell of support. I'll tag Backcountry Hunters and Anglers here because they were one of the first organizations to focus on public lands and the advocacy for public lands and public land managers and the public's right to use the public lands as we have since 1891. Additionally, I've been doing this research for years now, and one of the things I'd like to offer folks listening to this is a vision for the future. And I believe that the American people are going to answer absolutely yes, that we're going to keep the 193 million acres of U.S. Forest Service land and the 240 million acres of Bureau of Land Management land. And once again, I'm not going to give you a history lecture, but these were lands unclaimed by the Homestead Acts, okay? These were the lands that nobody wanted. In the case of some of eastern Montana, if you look at it, it's called Bankhead Jones lands. We gave the federal government the ability to take over abandoned lands after the Dust Bowl and after the Homestead Act of 1999, which John Wesley Powell begged them not to do it, right? They were like, don't give all this land away. It can't be farmed. It doesn't rain. Don't do it. But the railroads, which had received millions of acres of free land from the federal government to incentivize them to build the railroads, they wanted more customers. They wanted more people out there. And so we made this decision. And after enormous devastation, if you read Jonathan Rayband's Badland, one of my favorite books, people left, they abandoned a lot of these lands. And the federal government was able to reclaim them and restore them to some extent and then lease them out for grazing. On your map, if you still use physical maps, these lands are pink. And there's a bunch of them in eastern Montana, and there's some in New Mexico. But I guess I tell that story because these lands that we're enjoying the use of, if you hunt, if you fish, if you climb, if you ski, if you walk with your kids by a creek, if you drink water, if you irrigate, these lands are not an accident. They were unclaimed lands during the Homestead Acts and the railroad giveaways. And if you could have used them for something else, we would have. But we didn't. And we came up with this brilliant solution, which was the American public lands. And that, for some reason, we haven't gloried that. We have not glorified that brilliant idea. Instead, the focus has been the conflict. The focus has been extractive use versus environmental protection. And both sides were kind of at war with the U.S. Forest Service. Like, there were very few people who just said, I love the U.S. Forest Service, unless you worked there pursuing your passion on public lands of whatever it was. If you're a trail crew guy, trail crews generally come to love the place, But the new thing, the next thing we need to do, we're going to say, yes, we're going to keep the federal public lands in American public hands. And we're going to emphasize management own those lands, and we're going to have local employment. There's a lot of management that does need doing, and we can argue about what that is. If you're a hardcore environmentalist and you don't want any trees cut, you can say that, right? And if you're a logger and you want all the trees cut, you can say that. And we'll work it out. We'll hash it out somewhere to the middle. If you're a horse packer and you want all the trails cleared, then you need to vote for somebody who's going to give a budget to the U.S. Forest Service and hire your local kids to go in there and get that hard work done, preferably with a trail boss who's about 30 to 40 years old who knows a lot of stuff. And if you ever do that kind of work, even on a thinning crew, I've thinned, planted trails, I've done all of this work. One of my reasons for this is I was part of the white bark project where you climb the white bark trees and trying to figure out how to get the ones that are resistant to the disease, the blister rust. And that was one of the best experiences of my life. It's the best job I've ever had. It was a U.S. Forest Service contract. The best job I ever had was building bridges in the wilderness, doing trails. I mean, I'm going to try to wrap this up. So I want a future where these lands are valued by the American public who own them to the extent that we who know them know how incredible they are. And I want them part of an economic strategy where rural economies are bolstered by local employment on those lands. And when you ask this question in 20 years, do you think we should keep the federal public lands? People are not even going to listen to you. They're going to go, hell yes, we will. We are not getting rid of any of the assets that we hold in common in this country. If it's Arkansas, if it's the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky, we're keeping that. If it's the Bankhead National Forest in Alabama, that is going to be one of the most valuable places on this planet as the population grows and as more people need the solitude and solace of nature. We're going to keep all of them, and we're going to make them better than they've ever been before. And it's going to be an economic driver. It's going to be ecological resilience. It's going to be local employment. And it's going to be a healthier landscape. And are we going to fail on the way? Absolutely. We are human beings, and our choices we make are often fallible. And then we are going to argue about it, and we're going to move forward and get something better. We're going to fail better each time. We're going to do fuels reductions. And that's going to employ a bunch of strong sawyers, men and women all across the West. We're going to do watershed restoration on a grand scale. This is the future, man, and it's good. It is taking what I consider the most valuable asset owned by the American people right now that you can actually put your hands into, right? There's other assets like freedom, like civil rights, like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. These are kind of intangible but very important, right? This is a part of America. This is a part of our freedom, our legacy. This is what we're passing on to our kids. You can actually dig your hands into this dirt. You can actually climb these trees. You can hike these ridges all the way from the Bitterroot into Idaho and swim in the Selway River. This is the future, and it's really going to be good.
That's the voice of Hal Herring. And Hal is an award-winning journalist specializing in outdoor and Western topics with a focus on conservation and investigative reporting. Hal, we've been talking about public lands and connecting it to the benefits for Homo sapiens. I'm hoping that we could also take a moment to talk about wildlife connectivity as populations expand and habitats are getting fragmented, the importance of public lands in terms of that as well.
So for all of us who love to hunt or who are non-hunting wildlife advocates, and I hope that's everybody, the American public lands hold the last chance, the great chance for migratory corridors, connectivity for species that may be fragmented now. This is the place. I actually put that under ecological resilience. Mm-hmm. Again, if you're a fisherman or hunter, those things don't exist in isolation. They exist as the interest on the principle of well-managed landscapes. And so if you look at the migration corridors that are necessary for Western large animals to survive, they're going to be 90% on public land. And this is our chance to prioritize that. That doesn't mean you can't have energy development. That doesn't mean that you can't have grazing. You can have those things. But you can plan this to protect migration corridors across the West. You can plan your extractive industry, which you're always going to have because we need resources and we're going to take them. But the way you take them is the question. And what you leave behind is the question. And can you take them without destroying the other assets? And the answer to that is usually yes, but it may cost a little more. But costs less in the long run, doesn't it? So what we're talking about here is the connectivity. And I go all the way back to Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument down in southern Utah, That is actually a science monument. All of this has been lost in this conflict. I used to be down there sometime, and I love that place. I've always seen the edges of it, right? I've never made like a month-long trip through there, but the edges of it are pretty incredible. Or the Bears Ears National Monument up further north. These are also science monuments. There's like all kinds of pollinators that live in that Grand Canyon Escalante National Monument that don't live anywhere else, that need that one place where they can be part of a larger whole, a larger fabric, where they can survive into a future, even as people are pulling, what did the Jenga thing? They're pulling sticks out of the Jenga pile. These are the places where we can maintain ecological resilience, biodiversity, migration corridors. And that's going to be so important to our grandchildren and whoever takes ownership of all of this when we're gone, right? Aldo Leopold said, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts. Well, these public lands are the places where we can keep and restore all the parts. And I tell you, it will not be controversial in 25 more years when people see how many stressors are happening with the increased population and the increased need for resources. This will probably not be controversial in 25 to 50 years. Somebody will just say, wow, I'm so glad those people stood up and did the right thing, kept the American public lands in public hands where you have a say in what the priorities are. It's not going to be without conflict. But you have a say. On private land in the United States, we don't have a say. And you probably shouldn't. I don't want people coming on my land and telling me that I have to leave this and do this because somebody else values X. We don't have that here. What we do, we have that on the public lands. And it's going to be more and more obviously valuable as we move into this future.
That's the voice of Hal Herring, and we're talking about our public lands. Hal is an award-winning journalist specializing in outdoor and Western topics with a focus on conservation and investigative reporting. I'd like to end your show with 3 bits of advice that you would share with whoever's listening out there.
This is a participatory democratic republic, and nothing personifies that idea more than the American public lands. And so in a participatory democratic republic, you have to participate. And so for everybody, and I really don't care what your request is. It may be something I don't even like, but just participate. Vote, understand what the political elected officials believe, what they think before you vote for them. Understand your place in this, that you are empowered and you are part of this experiment, this grand experiment in liberty and balancing the common good with the individual autonomy. The world has never seen anything quite like this American experiment, and it's up to each one of us to make sure that it goes on. You asked for 3, the other one is go outside. And I don't care if it's sitting on your tailgate in your truck somewhere listening to music or a bird song, or it's taking a 10-day trip into the Washakie Wilderness. I don't care if it's going into the Everglades National Park or sitting in your backyard and watching a bee on a coneflower. Just go outside and let that reality bring you back into yourself and to your connection with things, because those connections are real. And we're missing them right now in the abstraction of all our technology and all the things, the chores and the things we have to do. And go outside and be quiet for a second, or don't. Walk around. The other one would be to pass this on. Make sure we pass this on to the children being born now and the children that are 2 and 3 and 4 years old. Baba Diom, the Senegalese environmentalist, he said, in the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we know, and we will know only what we're taught. And each and every one of us knows something to pass on so that this whole thing can carry into the future, because I think it's incredibly valuable, and I think that every one of us has a part to play in it.
Hal Herring, thank you so much for your time and energy joining me on the Trail Less Traveled.
Thank you very much. I'm proud to be here.
Hello, I'm Tom Poochler, board member with the Montana Wildlife Federation, the oldest conservation organization in Montana, dating back to 1936. Since our start, we've joined with landowners and others to address the loss of our wildlife resources, healthy habitat, and public access. As the days are getting longer and the snow recedes, we are able to get outdoors more often. Remember that while we have had a warm home and plenty of food over the long winter months, the wildlife we all enjoy have had to endure sub-zero temperatures and deep snow as they search for food. This time of year is crucial for their survival as fat reserves are depleted and any additional exertion can mean the difference between life and death. So when you see wildlife, give them some space and observe them from a distance. By doing that, we can ensure that Montana's wildlife continues to thrive for generations to come. For more information and to become a member of the Montana Wildlife Federation, visit montanawildlife.org. That's montanawildlife.org.
That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, conservation is not a spectator sport. Living in Missoula is a privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. Please get educated and engaged. Speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places. And if you think you're too small to make a difference, well then you've never spent the night with a mosquito.